This video is to show how to divide fractions, and we have 5 different ways, and our example is going to be 3/4 divided by a half, which means how many times does a half go into 3/4. And we're going to use what it means for the majority of these methods. The final method, it kind of doesn't matter what you're saying, what it means. You just do it. You just do the algorithm. But the rest of them really require that you understand that division, in a sense, is a way to say how many times does one number go into another. So let's start with the first method, and it's with drawing a picture. So we start with a whole, and we shade 3/4, and we shade a half, and the 3/4 there is in orange, the half is in green, and we're trying to figure out, well, how many of those green shapes fit in that total orange shape? How many halves are there in 3/4? And when we start to think of it, well, one of those halves is that left side, and then half of a half is that other orange square. So we've got one half on the left side and a half of a half on the right side. So how many halves are there? Well, there's 1.5. Next, we're going to use a ruler to sort of see the same thing. You know, how many of these halves are there in that total 3/4? But on a ruler, the fractions are in a straight line rather than in a rectangle. But I see that whole 3/4, and I see one of those halves right there. And so I try to figure out, okay, well, there's not an extra half. There's not 2 halves in 3/4. How much more is there? And I can see that a half of a half is that little shaded spot right there. And I can see that the extra is the same size. It's a 1/4 inch, and it's a half of a half. So how many halves are there altogether in 3/4? Well, there's 1.5. The next method is using repeated subtraction, and this one takes some doing. So I go ahead and I say, well, how many of those halves are there? Well, let me start subtracting. And if I can subtract one at a time, subtract the halves from 3/4 one at a time and get all the way down to 0 and count how many of them there were, I'll be able to see how many times a half goes into 3/4. So my first step is to get a common denominator because I'm subtracting. So I multiply top and bottom of a half by 2, and I've changed my problem to 3/4 minus 2/4. Subtracting that half one time, 3/4 minus 2/4 is 1/4. And we've got the same problem we had with the ruler in that we don't have an entire half left to subtract. When I think about it, a 1/4, what we have left, is a half of a half. So to take away all that 1/4, that's an extra half. So I've subtracted a half 1.5 times altogether. So how many times does a half go into 3/4? 1.5 times. The next method, really, it's the common denominator method, and you still are thinking how many times does a half go into 3/4, but it's in a certain respect less work. So you start similarly to the last one where you get a common denominator, so you multiply top and bottom of a half by 2 and turn your problem into 3/4 divided by 2/4. But asking how many times does 2/4 go into 3, that really is equivalent to asking how many times does 2 go into 3. And well, 1.5 times. And in general, how many times does one number go into another? The other number divided by the first number. Every time. Alright, so the final method for dividing is multiplying by the reciprocal, and that's just simply taking the original 3/4 divided by half and calling it 3/4 times the reciprocal of 1/2. And reciprocal just means flip the fraction over. So the reciprocal of 1/2 is 2/1. And so when we multiply fractions, you multiply across, so that's 6/4. But I prefer to look for a common factor. before I actually multiply. So I know I'm going to have to see if there's a common factor in 6 and another same factor in 4, and these numbers are small enough maybe I could see it anyway. But it's, in general, easier to find those common factors if you do it before you multiply. And here I see 2 times 1 in the top and 2 times 2 on the bottom. So I'm going to take out that 2 from top and bottom, and I get 3 over 2, which is 1.5.